right, on to our next presenter. Ben Wu is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of English at the University of Calgary presently. Sorry? Oh, nothing, okay. Where was I? He's conducting a study on working conditions in the comic book industry. Oh. I'm sorry. Oh, hell. That's why you don't let me talk. He did his graduate work at Simon Fraser University School of Communication, where he wrote an award-winning dissertation on one city's nerd culture scene. He is going to be teaching at Carleton University Communication Studies program this fall in Ottawa. He was also speaking at the Calgary Comic Con and did a presentation on, what was it called, Nerd versus Geek? Or, yeah, difference between nerd versus geek. It was a great talk. Anyhow, Benjamin Wood.
Thanks very much. Frank, do you want your phone? I spend a lot of time at the university around people that could be described as nerdy in their own particular ways, but it's always nice to be back amongst, your own people for real. Thank you very much to Frank for the invitation and to everyone who's made this possible. So you know what's coming, unfortunately, so I'll just get right to it. One of the, I think, for me at least, one of the most memorable lines in the 1989 Tim Burton Batman film is one of Jack Nicholson's as the Joker. Just after Batman rescues Vicky Vale and leaps away on his grappling gun, he says, anyone? Where does he get all those wonderful toys? Great line, great question. But the better question might be, where does he keep them? After all, getting things can be relatively easy, but storing them, that's the most important part, the storing. Now, before you actually me, obviously Batman keeps his things in the Batcave, but most of us were not so fortunate to inherit a stately manor on top of porous limestone bluffs, or a full-time English butler to dust our stuff for us. So for us, storing and caring for the things that we collect, for the things that we need in order to pursue our interests and passions, is a real, inevitable problem in everyday life. And that, in part, may be why the bigger on the inside trope is so prevalent in geek media. From the obvious example of the TARDIS, to the holodeck, or, if you prefer, Dreamatorium, to D&D's famous bag of holding, and even a certain magical armoire. All of these cases of something that can hold a lot more stuff on the inside than it appears to be able to on the outside can be read as a kind of wish fulfillment. But that's a wish that's grounded in a very real kind of thing. Tonight I want to talk to you about the real basis of that wish, the material substrate of geek culture and fandom. I also want to talk about the processes of negotiation that are involved in sharing and maintaining domestic space when you are a collector of things. I want to talk about the cycle of acquisition and disposal of goods that we're all caught up in. And finally, a little bit about the promise of digitization and the impact that digital technologies, cloud storage, and these sorts of things are having on collecting practices. Now, a longer version of this argument is going to be published in a special issue of the open access journal Transformative Works and Cultures. It's a special issue on object-oriented fandom, which is going to be published next week. So you can go to that URL and read the longer, more detailed, more thoroughly evidenced version of some of these arguments, if that's your sort of thing. This talk, the article, is based on research that I conducted as part of my doctoral studies at Simon Fraser University, where I was looking at one city's, again, the geek culture or nerd culture scene, I was interested in some key questions here about what it's actually like to participate in contemporary geek culture as opposed to some of the existing literature that focuses on changing representations of nerds in movies and television. I was interested in what's it like on the ground for people who are actually participating in the different kinds of institutions that make up a scene within a city, comic book shops, game stores, conventions, events like this, those sorts of things, as well as the individual experience of someone who moved between those different sorts of spaces and events, and how those sorts of activities came to mean things to them in their lives. One important theme in the interviews that I conducted as part of this research was the limits of participating in geek culture, the things that kept people from participating as much as they'd like to, the things that made it more or less difficult for them to enjoy the practices and activities that were important to them. Now, the obvious answers when you ask someone, well, what would it take to allow you to participate more, or what keeps you from participating in the way that you'd like to? Obvious answers are things like money and time. Two of my interviewees had mobility-related disabilities, and so ease of physical access by transit, by the actual structure of venues where things were held, those things became important to them. Other people talked about real-life commitments, such as work and their responsibilities as spouses and parents. But something I didn't expect going in, but which nonetheless became a key finding, something that came up over and over again in my interviews, participant observation, and various research activities, was simply space. I'm talking about, in this case, about physical space, storage space, space in the domestic sphere of the home. That is, where do you put your stuff? How do you manage it? And how do you share your space with other people? Now, from a certain point of view, which is to say the natural viewpoint of everyday social experience, these kinds of questions and problems are perhaps so mundane and ordinary as to be almost unremarkable. We all have stuff, we all have to figure out where to put it, we all have to dust it. And yet, both everyday discourse and academic studies of fandom almost entirely neglect these issues and these questions. Instead, we tend to talk about fandom in terms of interests, passions, or enthusiasms, which are all fundamentally emotional and therefore also like mental categories. Now, there are certainly times when it's appropriate and valuable to ask what it means or how it feels to participate in some activity. But as a social scientist, any study of human behavior has to be able to account, at least in principle, for the fact that those behaviors, everything that we do as human beings, are fundamentally material behaviors because we ourselves and the world around us is material, are material. The idea of culture has become so associated with ideas and beliefs and values. These are the sorts of categories that we lump in when we think about the cultural or culture. It's become so associated with ideas and beliefs and values that scholars have had to coin the term material culture to describe the study of the objects and artifacts that human beings make and use. But this term, material culture, is of course redundant because there's not really any such thing as immaterial culture. There are no ideas or beliefs without brains to think them, without vocal cords to express them, and without physical media to store and circulate them in. And of course, we use material objects in all sorts of ways to carry out practices that are obviously cultural in nature. I mean, we could think about this event as a cultural activity, and obviously you can think about all of the material goods that were required to make this come off. The stage that I'm standing on, the projector, the tables and chairs, the building, the beer. All of these things are material goods that we are adding together in order to pull off this obviously cultural activity. So in a real immediate sense, objects equip us to be fans, to pursue our interests, to do culture. You can't play in the Society for Creative Anachronism without a period costume, or enjoy a game like Warhammer without an army of miniature figurines and terrain, right? You can't successfully engage in comic book fandom without some access to comics and graphic novels. And as this sort of example points to, even the seemingly immaterial pleasures of character and narrative and story, these typically require screens to watch things on or pages to read them on. Material goods are the prerequisites for participation in these activities, and therefore in the communities that are built up around them. So this perhaps lends credence to portrayals that we sometimes see of geeks as voracious consumers of gadgets and collectibles. And I certainly found lots of evidence of people engaging in collecting behavior during my study. As one interviewee, who was the president of a local gaming organization, put it, "Where does geek culture congregate, and what does it congregate over? It congregates in stores and places of business, and it congregates over collections and collectibles and status that's driven by possessions and material goods." And you may quibble with the relative importance of material goods, but nonetheless it's clear that a well-curated collection, a rare comic book, a first edition novel, these sorts of collections do give status, lend status to people. So that is to say, we collect and acquire things in order to take part in social worlds. But, and here's the big but, once we acquire them, all these goods must be cleaned, they must be maintained, they must be kept organized. At the most basic level, they take up the limited space that we have in our homes. Thus, our reliance on objects, the necessity to have and use them, constitutes a problem that we have to constantly resolve day in and day out. So not only is our space, I'll let you guess which one I am. So not only is our space finite, but many of us share it with other people. For instance, two of my informants, who I'll call Diana and Steve, described themselves as a geek family. That is, both adults in this family were fans and participants in a range of nerdy practices. The family that plays D&D together stays together until they fall out over the division of the loot, I guess. Now, their home was zoned. This is a term that I came to use to describe this practice of dividing up and devoting certain spaces in the house for certain functions. And oftentimes in geeks' homes, there are rooms, there are spaces, there are shelves, there are areas that are devoted to their geeky collections, and some areas where they're kept away. In Diana and Steve's home, there was a spare bedroom that was turned into a library for their collection of fantasy and science fiction novels, and a closet of gaming supplies, which they referred to as the man closet, though they did both play Dungeons & Dragons. However, zoning is always a negotiation when you live with other people. Diana viewed herself as ruthlessly unsentimental when it came to physical objects, while Steve found it harder to get rid of things, many of which he had deep emotional and nostalgic attachments to. Other people involved in the study could not or would not maintain these kinds of zones. One interviewee in particular lived in a basement apartment that might as well have come straight out of an episode of Hoarders. The cultural anthropologist Mary Douglas once defined dirt as matter out of place. She said, "What is dirt? Dirt is matter that is out of place." What she realized is that dirt is fine when it's in the garden and when it's outside. It only becomes dirty when it gets inside your house where it's not supposed to be. Similarly, much of our relationship with things is about keeping them in the right place. And the aesthetic of messiness that was embodied in this particular apartment, as well as some of the comic book and game shops that I visited in my time, in some ways represents a refusal to discriminate between domains of life, a refusal to say that there is any space in my life that isn't fandom space. Instead, these different activities were piled up on top of one another, allowing this informant, allowing his fandom to surround him, waking and sleeping in this dankish hovel. Now, most people, though, did in fact try to manage their things. Thus, for fear of becoming hoarders, and often under pressure from loved ones, they were perpetually in the middle of a cycle of binging and purging objects. Some first tried to reduce the amount of room that their things took up through more efficient organization or by disposing of packaging. One informed was a Lego collector and decided, I guess I could part with all the boxes as long as I can keep the sets. They'll take up less space that way. Others made use of external storage, whether in rented storage spaces or in parental homes. The latter was unsurprising among members of the university anime and gaming club that I interviewed, who complained that their Magic cards and their Warhammer figurines were still at mom and dad's house. But even a grown-up like Steve, who had a home and a family of his own, said that he had a, quote, whole whack of stuff that remained at his parents' house on the other side of the country. And every time he would go to visit them, he would take a spare suitcase and bring a few things back. Even with these strategies, however, people eventually run out of room. They run out of space, and choices have to be made. At the best of times, purging objects was therapeutic. It was a chance to clear out some of that literal, but also maybe psychological clutter. Get rid of things. Decide maybe I don't really care so much about Star Wars, anymore, or whatever it is. This process of purging, however, is rarely done entirely wholeheartedly. I didn't talk to anybody who was, really excited to throw away all that stuff that they collected over the past 20 years. And there are certainly times when the loss of objects was a source of tremendous regret. This is from one interview who was talking about his comic book collection. The most money I ever spent on a comic was Iron Fist 14, which is the first appearance of Sabretooth. And I think I spent $150 on that, and that one took me 3 years to find a copy. Like I hadn't even seen a copy of it until I found that, and it was in really good condition. And I ended up selling it, which was a big mistake, to pay rent probably. Another interviewee talked about a storage space she had that flooded. That's probably something that many of you in this room can relate to after last year. And that flood destroyed a library of books, clothing, photos, mementos, an Apple II that was still functional. 8 years on, the loss of these things was still keenly felt as a kind of trauma, a loss that she was still learning to cope with. Now, maybe it would have been better if all those things had been uploaded into the cloud, right? Some people have promised or suggested that digital technologies might be a way of escaping some of these kinds of intractable problems, seemingly intractable problems I've been describing. What do you do with your stuff? Scan it and throw it out, right? And this is not a new kind of way of thinking. The media scholar Lisa Gittleman says that, digital technologies have promised to, quote, make the means of communication virtual, freeing information from the limits of physicality, from tangible things like pages, books, and files, end quote. Think of the promise that we've been waiting for all this time of the paperless office, or the ways that streaming music and video services are supposed to free us from the necessity of buying and storing discrete discs of plastic in our houses. Many of my interviewees were in fact optimistic about these technologies. Here one says, I get guilty about the amount of space things take up and the amount of stuff that people have, like just a little bit of global consciousness, that I feel like if I can have it in a digital format that's archivable and real and easy to read, then I'd rather have that because it's not taking up any space except on my hard drive, and that's an acceptable place. Now, this way of thinking is very seductive because it so neatly meshes with the ready-to-hand ways we have of thinking about culture and fandom, which I described previously, about thinking of them as mental rather than material processes. Certainly, computer-mediated communication has indeed transformed how fandoms organize themselves. Perhaps you heard about this event on Twitter or Facebook, and certainly we're engaged in some computer-mediated communication with the Edmonton group right now. But nonetheless, dematerialization is more rhetoric than reality. The idea of paperless fandom, first of all, is only thinkable, it's only conceivable with respect to those goods that can be imagined as content that can be separated from a physical medium, which is not always possible with all kinds of fanish goods, necessary things. You can't scan those Warhammer figurines and still play with them the same way. Furthermore, remediating an activity or a text doesn't simply store it in a different way, it transforms it into a different object and suggests different ways of interacting with it. For example, although Steve happily subscribed to the D&D Insider service so that he didn't need to purchase and store all of the rule books needed to run his campaign, he retained a strong emotional connection to his print D&D manuals that no virtual object could displace. Quote, "Just even to open the copy, it's the artwork, it's the feel of the book, the size, the shape, it's everything that goes along with it." And no one that I talked to viewed digital games as a substitute for pen and paper role-playing games or for other kinds of in-person activities. They were qualitatively different experiences that added on to those existing activities rather than replacing them. In fact, the uses of digital media that I observed were mostly quotidian and integrated into daily life around many of the same old goals and problems. They supported primary practices, former activities, or generated new spin-off activities, but their ability to enable communication and interaction with real people was more important than their virtuality. Material practices of acquisition and curation, furthermore, also apply to digital objects. Anyone who's spent a lot of time editing their iTunes metadata, like, you know what I'm talking about, right? And these sorts of activities still require our brains and our hands to do them. In point of fact, not even digital information is truly immaterial, although it may seem that way to those of us who are privileged enough to have high-speed bandwidth connections and cheap storage. Digital information lives on computers and servers that need to be powered and kept cool. It has to travel through a series of tubes that have physical limitations on how much data they can transmit. It's vulnerable to planned obsolescence, catastrophic hard drive failure, and human error. Digitization doesn't solve the problems of materiality, it only entangles them with a new set of devices. So notwithstanding the new powers afforded by networked computers and the accompanying hype, the material world has to be accounted for, because ultimately there's nothing but the material world. Fandom may be distinguished from other forms of consumption by the emotionally charged, potent relationships to culture that it involves, but it remains a form of human practice that inevitably takes, uses, and is enabled, but also constrained by physical objects. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Come on, someone's got a quote on the Apple TV too, because that really hurt. Does everyone get that one? Who's got an Apple TV 2? Who's got an Apple TV 2? No one? I do.
Thank you, that was really quite interesting. I'm just curious if you could talk a little more about the culture or the divide between online gaming or online geeking or nerding out and real life material geeking out. Because I do wonder if there's kind of, I mean, some avid gamers really love the 3D world or really participate in that online world and then turn off their computer with kind of a click of the mouse and then they're back into their other materiality. So could you speak a little bit about your thoughts on that and your research on that?
Sure. So first of all, I will say that I purposely focused principally on spaces of face-to-face interaction because I was interested in the articulation of a local scene, and also because there's a lot of great work being done on online spaces, and relatively little that's been done about the physical game shop or the physical comic shop, the physical comic convention, those sorts of activities. So my study's a little biased in that way. So digital stuff came in, but because of the fact that people who do those things also do digital things, as opposed to people who are, for whom online practices are their main thing. Now, as to the substance of your question, I guess the first answer I would say is, Alfred Hitchcock famously said, the length of a film is determined by the endurance of the human bladder. There's only so long you can sit in a theater and pay attention before nature calls, because guess what? We're like biological organisms that are made of meat and do things. And so in many ways, I think what I'm trying to get at with that is that in thinking of virtual environments, of online spaces, as spaces that are somewhere else, we're maybe thinking about them the wrong way, and we need to sort of shift that around. The primary space that we occupy when we occupy virtual worlds is a chair in front of a computer. And it allows us to communicate with people in novel ways and interesting ways, lets us do cool things, but fundamentally we're not anywhere different when we're in the World of Warcraft, in Azeroth. We're still sitting in front of our computers. We have to put those computers in a room somewhere, whether it's in our home or if we're at an internet cafe or a gaming, at a LAN party. People still have LAN parties? Yeah, okay. Okay. So we're in a room somewhere, we're eating Cheetos, we're in front of a computer that came from somewhere that has rare earth minerals in it, and that are the sweat of our brow paid for. So the idea that participating in playing a digital game somehow means we're escaping materiality, I think, is a red herring that has more to do with some of the rhetoric of the late 90s techno-utopianism, more than the actual experience of what it's like to participate in any of those activities.
So I have a question about where, or how you define where geek or nerd culture stops. So a lot of the examples you brought up were sort of the toys and collectibles. You talked about like personal libraries, so you showed images of the comic book collection, and then you talked about Diana and Steve and their sci-fi collection. What happens if I'm a collector of classical literature? Am I still a fan? Do I belong to geek nerd culture at that point? Or even worse, or even better, what if my collection includes all of those elements? Like mine does at home, comic books, graphic novels, but classical literature as well. It has all of those things in it. Does that still would that still be included in sort of the set of participants that you were including in your small group of actual ethnographic informants?
Right. So the first thing was, my study was designed around the principle that there are ways to opt in and there's no way to be opted out. Having books other than comic books or science fiction novels in your home doesn't make you not a participant. The other thing is again, I'm talking about participants in a culture rather than trying to talk about geeks or nerds as kinds of discrete types of people. I was interested in what it's like to participate in that culture, and all that it takes to be a participant is to go and participate, right? I tried to keep I tried to define that cultural field or that scene in a sort of a bottom-up way, what we would call an inductive way. I started with, yes, the obvious things that are sort of classically associated with geek culture. So again, in the first stage of my project, when I was looking at institutions, it was comic stores, game stores, conventions of various kinds, a couple of fan clubs. Moving to the interview phase, then I was interested in, okay, well, the people who occupy these spaces, what else do they do that I wasn't capturing that first time around? What do they consider to be part of, the culture that they participate in when I ask them about, their fandom or their geekiness? What don't they consider part of it? What is sort of a separate persona or a separate role for them? So I sort of built it up that way. So yeah, that's a long way of saying that, yeah, if you like fancy books, I mean, great. Good for you. I'm in the Department of English. I can't fault that.
All right, thank you very much, Ben.